So, imagine you're walking through this really beautiful Mediterranean coastal town. The sun is setting, the water is just this brilliant turquoise color, and you're strolling toward the beach.
Sounds pretty ideal, to be honest.
Right. But then suddenly you trip over this massive reinforced concrete dome that's just protruding right out of the sand.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And you walk another 100 yards, and there's another one like half hidden in the brush. You look up toward the hills and you spot dozens more of them just staring out at the sea.
Like dead gray eyes.
Exactly. And the thing is, in a country roughly the size of Maryland, there are over 170,000 of these military bunkers.
That is just an insane number.
They are everywhere, in city parks, in the middle of farm fields, tucked into the sides of these remote mountains. They're basically the physical scars of, the most paranoid dictatorship in modern European history.
It's such a jarring juxtaposition, you know? You have this breathtaking ancient landscape, and it's completely dotted with these architectural manifestations of pure terror and isolation.
Yeah, it immediately tells you that the history of this place is just anything but ordinary. And that bizarre, complex history is exactly what we're going to unpack today on the Deep Dive.
Which is exciting.
It is. So today is March 20th, 2026. And if you've been paying any attention to the news lately, you know the cycle has been just heavily dominated by the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East.
Right.
But running parallel to that, there's this growing, somewhat anxious chatter about a deepening divide between the United States and Europe. We're constantly hearing these debates about the so-called transatlantic gap.
Yeah, you hear about NATO funding, trade tariffs, shifting cultural values. The relationship is under an immense microscope right now.
Exactly. But when you actually dig into the sources, the reality is that the bonds between Europe and the U.S. are massively complex.
Yeah.
And they're really deeply rooted. I mean, we've shaped each other's demographics and economies in ways we often just totally take for granted.
We really do.
So to help build some context for the news you're hearing, and to help you understand the people you might meet from across the globe, we're launching a brand new overarching mission for this show. We're calling it The Topic Lens.
And the goal here is to really build a bridge of context across the Atlantic.
Right.
And the structure for this new series is going to be a bit different. We're going to move alphabetically. So we'll dissect a European country, and then in the following episode, we'll cross the ocean to dissect an American state.
Because, European nations are incredibly diversified. They have these unique identities forged over hundreds, sometimes thousands of years.
And American states operate almost like individual countries themselves, right?
Yeah.
They have their own distinct economies, cultural eccentricities, even their own legal traditions, even though they all share a language.
So by placing them side by side like this, alphabetically, we want to give you a really comprehensive lens on how different societies build their identities. Which brings us to today. We are starting with the letter A for a European nation that is deeply misunderstood, I think.
Very much so.
It's frequently overlooked by the broader public, but it's undeniably one of the most resilient and fascinating places on Earth. We are talking about Albania.
Albania, yes.
Now, we have a massive stack of sources in front of us, but we aren't going to do like a tedious year-by-year history lecture.
Nobody wants that.
Right. Our mission today is to give you the essential pegs to hang Albanian history on. We need to figure out why this isolated European nation has this intense, almost unparalleled pro-Americanism.
Which is fascinating in itself.
It really is. We're also going to look at how they built this massive global diaspora that heavily influences modern pop culture and break down the incredible story behind their national logo, their flag, plus everyday life, politics, all of that.
But to understand any of that, we really have to start with the physical reality of the place. Because geography is destiny, right? Especially in the Balkans.
For sure. So Albania sits in Southeast Europe on the western edge of the Balkan Peninsula. Its entire western border runs right along the Adriatic and Ionian Seas.
And the terrain is just incredibly extreme.
Yeah, I was looking at the topographical maps, and it's a relatively small nation, about 28,000 square kilometers. Like I mentioned, that's roughly the size of Maryland or, Connecticut and Rhode Island combined. But the sheer verticality of the country is staggering.
The geography actively resists centralization. Up in the north, you have the Albanian Alps, which are part of the Dinaric Alps range. These are jagged, unforgiving limestone peaks that stay snow-capped for a large chunk of the year.
And those mountains basically acted as an impenetrable fortress historically, right?
Exactly. They fostered this fiercely independent tribal society because it was logistically impossible for any central authority, whether Roman, Byzantine, or Ottoman, to truly enforce their rule up there.
But then you drive south, and within a matter of hours, the landscape transforms completely. You hit the Albanian Riviera.
The contrast is wild.
The sources describe it as having this turquoise, crystal-clear water that genuinely rivals the Caribbean, backed by steep mountains that just drop right into the sea. And they share land borders with Montenegro to the northwest, Kosovo to the northeast, North Macedonia to the east, and Greece to the south.
We also have to highlight its maritime neighbor, though. The Strait of Otranto separates Albania from the heel of Italy's boot.
Oh, right. How wide is that stretch of water?
It's just 72 kilometers wide. That's about 45 miles. You could take a fast ferry across in almost no time.
Wow. So they're incredibly close to Italy.
Very close. And that geographic proximity is a crucial mechanism for understanding their modern economy and their historical cultural exchanges. It really served as their primary window to the West during their periods of intense isolation.
Makes total sense. So let's look at the people actually living inside those borders today. The official population figures usually hover around 2.4 to 2.8 million.
Right, which puts it right around the population of, say, Kansas or New Mexico.
But when you dig into the demographic data in our stack, those numbers are highly deceptive. There is this massive structural crisis happening beneath the surface.
Yeah, Albania is currently undergoing a severe demographic inversion. The population is aging at a rate that is setting off alarm bells for economists everywhere.
I saw that in the census data. The average age jumped from 35.3 in 2011 to 42.5 in 2023.
Which is a seismic shift for a national demographic profile in just over a decade.
A 7-year jump in the median age over 12 years. That means you aren't just having fewer babies, you are actively losing your youth. The mechanism driving this is a relentless brain drain, right?
Exactly. Ambitious, educated young Albanians are leaving the country at staggering rates. They're primarily heading to Western Europe or the United States to seek better wages and, more stable institutions.
And that emigration rate creates this really complex economic paradox.
It does. On one hand, it leaves the domestic economy with a shrinking, aging workforce that makes it incredibly difficult to build sustainable industries or even fund pension systems.
Right. But on the other hand,
those young people who leave send massive amounts of money back home. These remittances from the diaspora make up a huge structural pillar of the Albanian GDP.
so they are essentially exporting their labor force to keep the domestic economy afloat.
Precisely.
We will definitely get into the massive scale of that diaspora later because their global footprint is wild. But I want to focus on the core identity of the people themselves for a second because the most fascinating aspect of Albanian culture is the language.
Oh, absolutely.
It's called Shqip, and linguistically it is an absolute outlier.
It really is. In the study of linguistics, you have the Indo-European language family, which is this massive tree that encompasses almost everything spoken from Europe all the way to India.
Right. So you have the Germanic branch, which
Right.
gives us English and German. You have the Romance branch with Spanish, French, and Italian. You have the Slavic branch, the Indo-Iranian branch.
And Albanian does not belong to any of them. It occupies its own standalone solitary branch on that tree.
That's just wild to me. It's basically a linguistic island surrounded by a sea of completely different languages.
Exactly. It's not like Basque, which is a true language isolate with no known relatives anywhere. Albanian is Indo-European, but it diverged so early and remains so isolated that it has no close living linguistic cousins.
It has borrowed some vocabulary over the centuries, right? From Latin and Greek and Turkish.
It has, but its grammatical core and root structure are entirely its own.
So how does a language like that survive in a region that has been conquered by literally every major empire in human history?
Well, the survival of the language is a testament to that rugged geography we discussed earlier. When the Romans and later the Slavic migrations swept through the Balkans, the speakers of this Proto-Albanian language retreated into those impenetrable mountains.
Ah, right.
And the dominant historical and linguistic theory, and this forms the absolute bedrock of modern Albanian national identity, is that Albanians are the direct, unbroken descendants of the ancient Illyrians.
The Illyrians, those were the Indo-European people who inhabited the Western Balkans thousands of years ago, right? Long before the Roman Republic even expanded across the Adriatic.
Correct. And this isn't just an interesting piece of ancient trivia. In the Balkans, history is a weapon. Claiming Illyrian descent is a mechanism for asserting absolute indigenous primacy.
It's their core political and existential anchor. Because the Slavic migrations into the Balkans, which brought the ancestors of the modern Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks, that didn't happen until the 6th and 7th centuries AD.
Exactly. So for Albanians, their Illyrian roots mean they were there first. They view themselves not as latecomers to the peninsula, but as the original inhabitants who were slowly pushed into the mountains by successive waves of invaders.
You can easily see how that ancient blood and geography identity anchors a massive sense of national pride. I mean, if your entire historical narrative is based on the idea that you are the sole survivors of an ancient civilization, clinging to your unique language against all odds, that breeds a very specific type of resilience.
It definitely does. Even the very word they use for themselves, shqiptar, derives from a root word meaning to understand clearly or to speak intelligibly.
To speak Albanian is to be Albanian. The language is the border.
And this ancient claim fuels ongoing regional tensions. When multiple modern nations lay claim to the same geographic space, the argument often boils down to who has the oldest historical deed to the land. The Illyrian hypothesis is a powerful geopolitical tool in those debates.
Right. But beyond the politics, it instills this fierce tribal solidarity. And if that ancient pride is the foundation of their identity, then understanding how they weaponize that pride naturally leads us to the ultimate symbol of Albanian resistance.
Because you don't keep a unique language alive for thousands of years surrounded by hostile empires simply by hiding. Eventually, you have to fight.
Which brings us to the 15th century, their greatest national hero, and the origin of their iconic flag. We are talking about Gjurg Kastrioti, better known to the world as Skanderbeg.
Skanderbeg is the central pillar of Albanian historical memory.
Yeah, the sources make that very clear. So to understand his impact, we really have to understand the mechanics of the Ottoman Empire's expansion into Europe in the early 1400s.
Right, because the Ottomans didn't just conquer territory through brute force. They used a highly sophisticated bureaucratic system to integrate newly conquered lands. And one of their most effective tools was the devshirme system.
Often referred to as the blood tax.
Yes.
The sources outline this in detail, and it's just a fascinatingly ruthless mechanism for empire building. The Ottomans would take young boys from Christian noble families in the conquered territories, essentially holding them as high-status hostages.
But they didn't throw them in a dungeon.
No. They converted them to Islam, educated them in the Sultan's court, and trained them to be elite soldiers or administrators.
The logic was brilliant, honestly. By stripping these boys of their local tribal affiliations and raising them to be loyal only to the Sultan, the Ottomans created a fiercely loyal administrative and military class, the Janissaries.
And Skanderbeg was born into an Albanian noble family, the Kastriotis. As a young boy, he was taken through this exact system.
He was. He was raised in the Ottoman court, converted to Islam, and educated in their elite military academies.
And he turned out to be a total military prodigy. He rose through the ranks of the Ottoman army, eventually becoming a top general. The Ottomans gave him the title Iskander Bey, which translates to Lord Alexander, explicitly comparing his tactical genius to Alexander the Great.
Right, and Iskander Bey eventually morphed into Skanderbeg. He was literally one of the empire's most lethal weapons.
But then, in 1443, during a battle against European Christian forces near modern-day Serbia, the narrative completely flips. Skanderbeg executes a highly coordinated defection.
It's like something out of a movie. He abandons the Ottoman army, takes a contingent of loyal Albanian soldiers with him, and marches straight back to his ancestral homeland.
And he captures the vital fortress city of Kruj using forged documents, reconverts to Christianity, and effectively declares war on the most powerful empire on the planet.
Skanderbeg's resistance was essentially a 15th century insurgency. He knew he couldn't line up his relatively small forces against massive Ottoman armies on open battlefields. The Ottomans had overwhelming numbers and advanced siege artillery.
So he used the geography. He turned the jagged Albanian Alps into a weapon.
He was a master of asymmetric warfare. For 25 years, Skanderbeg managed to unite the famously fractured, feuding Albanian clans into a single, cohesive military front, which was called the League of Leze.
And he utilized hit-and-run guerrilla tactics, right? Ambushing Ottoman supply lines in the narrow mountain passes where their superior numbers just meant nothing.
Exactly. He won over 24 major battles against forces commanded by the sultans themselves, holding off wave after wave of invasions.
The Pope in Rome actually gave him the title Champion of Christ because his resistance effectively acted as a shield for Western Europe, delaying the Ottoman advance into Italy. But what strikes me as most interesting about his legacy today is its universal application within Albania.
It's true. Skanderbeg is celebrated by all Albanians today, completely transcending modern religious divides. Whether an Albanian family is historically Muslim, Catholic, or Orthodox, he is universally revered as the father of the nation.
He's the ultimate proof of concept for their national identity, right? A small, unified people standing up to a global superpower.
And he didn't just leave them a story of resistance. He provided the visual anchor for their modern state. He gave them their logo.
The flag, if you've seen the Albanian flag, it is impossible to forget. It's incredibly stark. A deep, blood-red background featuring a striking, sharp-edged, black, double-headed eagle dead in the center.
It is arguably one of the most distinctive and aggressive-looking flags in the world.
Yeah.
The double-headed eagle is a fascinating symbol because its lineage actually stretches back thousands of years to ancient Mesopotamia, but its direct route to the Albanian flag passes through the Byzantine Empire.
Right. The Roman Emperor Constantine the Great popularized the double-headed eagle to symbolize the vastness of his empire, with one head looking east toward Constantinople and the other looking west toward Rome.
So how does a Byzantine imperial symbol become the banner of a mountain insurgency?
Well, it was a matter of heraldic pragmatism. Following the collapse of the Byzantine presence in the region, several local Albanian noble families, including the powerful Muzaka family, adopted the double-headed eagle to claim a sort of regional legitimacy and continuity with the old empire.
Got it.
And Skanderbeg adopted this symbol as his personal family crest when he launched his rebellion. He flew a red banner with a black double-headed eagle over the fortress of Kruge.
Now, modern nations love to retroactively apply deep, poetic meanings to their flags. You constantly hear the common refrain that the red stands for the blood of fallen patriots, and the black represents their unyielding determination.
Right, and while that is a really powerful interpretation for modern Albanians, historically, Skanderbeg was likely just using the established heraldic colors of his lineage to project authority. But over centuries of struggle, that specific banner became inextricably linked with the concept of an independent Albanian identity.
Unfortunately for that independence, Skanderbeg was a mortal man. In 1468, he died of malaria.
And the resistance had been held together almost entirely by his sheer force of personality and tactical brilliance, right?
Yes. Without his unifying presence, the League of Lezi fractured, the clans turned back to their internal rivalries, and within a decade, the Ottomans fully absorbed the territory.
That collapse marks the beginning of over 400 years of continuous Ottoman rule.
4 centuries is a massive span of time to live under an occupying empire.
It is. And this is where the sources highlight an incredible paradox in the Albanian character. Because they were fiercely independent and famously rebellious, yet they also managed to maneuver themselves into the highest echelons of power within the very empire that conquered them. How does that mechanism work?
It comes down to an extreme cultural pragmatism. The Ottoman Empire operated on the millet system, which organized society along religious lines rather than ethnic ones. As a Christian under Ottoman rule, you were subject to the jizya, which is a special tax levied on non-Muslims. You also face restrictions on property ownership and your ability to carry weapons, which, in a mountain culture, is a severe blow to your social standing.
So converting to Islam wasn't necessarily a matter of mass spiritual awakening or being forced at the tip of a sword. It was an economic and social strategy.
Precisely. Over those 4 centuries, the majority of the Albanian population gradually converted to Islam to bypass these restrictions. Converting meant you paid lower taxes, you could keep your land, you could bear arms, and crucially, you could advance within the Ottoman administration.
And they didn't just advance, they dominated. Dozens of Albanians became Grand Viziers, which is essentially the prime minister of the Ottoman Empire.
They provided top generals and provincial governors too. Muhammad Ali, the commander who essentially founded modern Egypt in the 19th century, was an Albanian military commander.
That's crazy. So they integrated into the imperial machinery, but they aggressively refused to assimilate ethnically. They changed their religion to survive and thrive economically, but they maintained their strict clan structures, their customary laws, and above all, their language.
Yes, and in many other parts of the Balkans, national identity became entirely fused with religion. To be Serbian was to be Orthodox, to be Croatian was to be Catholic. But for the Albanians, the language always superseded the theology.
There was a phenomenon known as crypto-Christianity, right? where some Albanians would publicly practice Islam to gain the societal benefits, but secretly maintain Christian traditions at home.
Yes, it really highlights how fluid their approach to religious dogma was. In the late 19th century, during the Albanian National Awakening, an intellectual named Plushko Vasa wrote a famous poem pleading for national unity across religious lines. He coined a phrase that perfectly encapsulates this mindset.
Oh, right. The religion of Albanians is Albanianism.
Exactly. The religion of Albanians is Albanianism. They essentially place the survival of their linguistic and ethnic group above any adherence to a specific faith.
That pragmatism allowed them to survive 400 years of Ottoman rule. But that survivalist mindset was put to the ultimate test when the Ottoman Empire finally began to crumble in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Because as the Ottoman grip on the Balkans weakened, a huge power vacuum opened up. The neighboring states Serbia, Montenegro, and Greece had already achieved their independence and were aggressively looking to expand their territories.
And they viewed the Albanian populated lands as prime real estate, largely because the Albanians, having integrated so heavily into the Ottoman system, were kind of late to formalize their own modern nationalist movement.
Right, and this external threat triggered the Relinja, or the National Awakening. The Albanian leaders realized that if they didn't assert a unified political identity immediately, their homeland was going to be carved up and absorbed by their neighbors.
So in 1878, they formed the League of Prizren to lobby the great European powers for the territorial integrity of the Albanian lands.
And those diplomatic struggles culminated on November 28, 1912. In the coastal city of Vlori, amidst the chaos of the First Balkan War, a leader named Ismail Kamali gathered delegates from across the Albanian territories and officially declared independence.
He stepped out onto a balcony and raised the flag, the exact same red and black double-headed eagle banner that Skanderbeg had flown centuries earlier.
Which is why today, November 28th, is celebrated globally by the diaspora as National Flag Day.
It sounds like a triumphant moment, like the culmination of centuries of struggle, but the historical consensus calls this a bitter victory. Why is that?
Because declaring independence is only half the battle. You need international recognition, and you need defined borders. In 1913, the great powers of Europe, Britain, France, Russia, Austria-Hungary, Italy, and Germany convened the London Conference of Ambassadors to settle the aftermath of the Balkan Wars. These diplomats sat in a room in London, looking at maps, and essentially engaged in massive geopolitical horse trading.
Right. Russia was pushing hard to maximize the territorial gains of its Slavic ally, Serbia. Austria-Hungary wanted an independent Albania to block Serbia from gaining access to the Adriatic Sea. It was just a proxy negotiation where the actual people living on the land were treated as afterthoughts.
And the resulting compromise was catastrophic for the Albanian people. The London Conference officially recognized an independent Albanian state, but the borders they drew were brutally restrictive.
They left roughly half of the ethnic Albanian population and a massive portion of their historical territory completely outside the borders of the new country.
Just pause and imagine the psychological impact of that. It's as if an international committee drew the borders of the United States, but decided everything west of the Mississippi River, along with tens of millions of your citizens, suddenly belonged to Mexico and Canada.
Wow. Millions of ethnic Albanians found themselves waking up as marginalized minorities in newly expanded Serbia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Greece.
The border trauma of 1913 is the defining geopolitical wound of the modern Albanian psyche. It created a permanent, lingering sense of being a divided, truncated nation.
It instilled a deep-seated realization that international treaties and the promises of the great European powers rarely, if ever, had their best interests at heart. They had been sacrificed to maintain the balance of power in Europe.
And the decades following independence didn't offer any stability to heal that wound. The interwar period is just a relentless whiplash of fragile governments.
Yeah, in 1924, they were briefly led by Fan Noli, who was this incredibly fascinating figure, a Harvard-educated Orthodox bishop and poet. But his democratic government only lasted a few months before he was ousted by a conservative tribal leader named Ahmet Zogu, who eventually just abolished the republic and crowned himself King Zog I.
King Zog attempted to modernize the country, but he relied heavily on financial and military support from fascist Italy. When World War II erupted, Mussolini's Italy outright invaded and annexed Albania, forcing King Zog into exile.
And after the Italians surrendered, Nazi Germany moved in and occupied the country. It was a relentless cycle of occupation and internal factional fighting.
But out of the ashes of World War II emerges the darkest chapter of their history. The communist partisans who had fought fiercely against the Italian and German occupiers seized total control of the country. They were led by a man named Enver Hoxha.
And over the next 4 decades, he would turn Albania into an isolationist nightmare that is frequently and accurately described as the North Korea of Europe.
The comparison to North Korea is really not hyperbole. While the rest of Eastern Europe fell under the influence of the Soviet Union as part of the Warsaw Pact, Hoxha took a radically different path.
He was a rigid, uncompromising Stalinist, and he was consumed by this intense paranoia regarding foreign influence. He believed that the entire world, both the capitalist West and the communist East, was conspiring to destroy him.
Let's break down the mechanics of his isolationism because it happened in stages. He didn't just wall the country off overnight. He systematically alienated every ally he had.
Right. First, he allied heavily with Yugoslavia under Tito, relying on them for economic aid. But when Tito broke with Stalin in 1948, Hoxha violently purged the pro-Yugoslav factions in his government and aligned firmly with the Soviet Union.
He relied on Moscow for a decade. But when Nikita Khrushchev came to power and began the process of de-Stalinization, denouncing the cult personality and the mass purges, Hoxha viewed this as a massive ideological betrayal.
He essentially called the Soviet leadership capitalist revisionists and broke off diplomatic relations with Moscow in 1961, which is an insane geopolitical gamble. You are a tiny, impoverished nation, and you just cut ties with the global superpower that was feeding you.
So he pivots to the only other hardline communist power available, Mao's China. China became their primary benefactor throughout the 1960s and 70s.
But then, following Mao's death, China began opening up to the West and engaging in economic reforms.
And once again, Hoxha declared them traitors to true Marxist-Leninism and severed ties with Beijing in 1978.
At that point, Albania was entirely alone. No allies in the West, no allies in the East. They pursued a policy of complete self-reliance, which in reality meant devastating economic stagnation and poverty.
And this absolute isolation bred a physical manifestation of paranoia that defined the landscape we talked about at the very beginning of the show, the bunkers.
Right. Hoxha was convinced that a multi-front invasion was imminent. He believed NATO forces were coming by sea and Warsaw Pact forces were coming by land.
So, to prepare for this imaginary invasion, he launched the bunkerization program. The regime diverted massive amounts of concrete, steel, and manual labor away from desperately needed housing and infrastructure, and instead built over 170,000 military bunkers.
They were designed to withstand artillery fire and were placed strategically along every beach, mountain pass, and city street. Families were assigned specific bunkers and told they would have to defend their local square footage to the death.
It is a staggering logistical achievement of pure madness. You couldn't walk without tripping over one.
But the external defense mechanisms were nothing compared to the internal control. Let's look at the Sigurimi, his secret police force.
The Sigurimi operated one of the most pervasive domestic surveillance networks in modern history. The mechanics of their control relied on the complete destruction of social trust. Estimates suggest that perhaps 1 in 3 citizens had been coerced or blackmailed into serving as informants at some point.
Think about the psychological toll of that. You couldn't speak freely to your coworkers. You couldn't trust your neighbors. In some tragic cases, children were manipulated into informing on their parents for complaining about food shortages.
And to speak out against the regime, or even to attempt to flee the country, didn't just mean prison for you. The regime practiced collective punishment.
If you defected, your entire extended family could be sent to brutal labor camps or internal exile in remote mountain villages.
Hoxha also sought to control the minds and spirits of his citizens completely. We discussed earlier how Albanians historically viewed religion through a pragmatic lens. Well, Hoxha decided to eradicate it entirely.
He believed religious institutions were a competing source of loyalty and a tool for foreign espionage. So in 1967, he escalated his campaign and declared Albania the world's first officially atheist state.
And the mechanics of this cultural erasure were brutal. Over 2,000 churches, mosques, monasteries, and Sufi texts were either demolished with explosives or repurposed into state-run sports halls, warehouses, and cinemas.
Owning religious texts like a Bible or a Quran was classified as a severe crime punishable by years in prison. Parents were forbidden from giving their children religious names. The state actually issued an approved list of secular national names.
An entire generation grew up in a complete spiritual vacuum, entirely disconnected from the traditions of their ancestors.
Hoxha ruled with an iron fist until his death in 1985. His successor tried to maintain the system, but the economy was collapsing under the weight of its own isolation. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and the rest of the Eastern Bloc began to democratize, the pressure inside Albania became unbearable.
By 1991, massive student protests and total economic failure finally forced the collapse of the communist regime.
You would naturally assume this is the happy ending, right? The dictator is dead, the regime has fallen, and the people are free to join the modern world. But the transition from a completely sealed, cashless command economy to a global free market was incredibly chaotic.
You have to put yourself in the shoes of an average Albanian citizen in 1991. They had been locked in a dark room for 4 decades. They had zero concept of a market economy, banking regulations, or financial risk. To them, capitalism itself seemed like magic. You put money in, and more money comes out.
Which sets the stage for one of the most wild and tragic economic disasters of the 20th century, the 1997 pyramid schemes. Now, if you're listening to this in a country with strict banking regulations, you're probably thinking, how on earth does an entire nation fall for a Ponzi scheme?
It functioned like a virus in an unimmunized financial system. In the mid-90s, the newly democratic government was pursuing aggressive privatization, but they failed to establish any meaningful regulatory oversight for the banking sector.
And several massive investment firms emerged. Companies like Vifa Holding and Suja, they started offering astronomical interest rates on deposits, sometimes promising returns of 10% to 50% per month.
Mathematically, that is impossible to sustain. But they weren't investing the money in productive assets. They were just using the deposits of new investors to pay off the early investors. The classic Ponzi structure.
But the crucial mechanism here is government complicity. These scheme operators were highly visible. They sponsored national sports teams, they ran television advertisements, and top government officials were seen attending their galas.
Because the government seemed to endorse them, the public trusted them completely. It became a national mania. People sold their apartments to invest the cash. Farmers sold their livestock.
The diaspora, who were working grueling jobs in Greece and Italy, sent all their remittances back to be invested in these schemes. By 1996, the nominal value of the liabilities in these schemes amounted to nearly half of the country's entire gross domestic product.
And then the math caught up with them. In early 1997, the influx of new investors dried up, and the schemes began to default. They couldn't pay the interest. The operators tried to flee, and the entire house of cards collapsed.
The realization that their life savings, their homes, and their futures had literally vanished overnight triggered absolute societal panic. The people blamed the government for failing to protect them and for likely profiting off the fraud. Peaceful protests rapidly evolved into violent riots.
The mechanics of the state simply dissolved. The police and the military, who had also lost their life savings, largely abandoned their posts. And then, furious citizens descended on the military armories scattered across the country.
They used tractors to pull the doors off bunkers and weapons depots. Estimates suggest over 1.5 million military firearms, assault rifles, grenades, anti-tank weapons were looted by the civilian population.
Albania descended into total anarchy. Armed gangs took control of entire cities in the south. The government lost control of the country, and a state of emergency was declared.
Foreign nations had to launch military evacuations of their citizens. Ultimately, the United Nations had to authorize a multinational military force, led by Italy, to enter the country, secure the infrastructure, and help restore basic order.
Think about the psychological reality of an Albanian citizen in the late 1990s. Your borders were drawn by foreign powers who gave away half your historical land. You suffered under a paranoid dictator who locked you away from the world.
And the moment you finally get freedom and democracy, your new government allows a predatory financial scheme to rob you blind, leading to the complete collapse of society. Who do you trust when institutions fail so spectacularly?
You don't trust the state, you don't trust politicians, and you certainly don't trust the police. When formal institutions evaporate, human beings revert to cultural baselines. You trust your immediate family, you trust your bloodlines, and you fall back on the ancient unwritten codes that guided your ancestors before the state ever existed.
Which brings us to a fascinating cultural concept. Beza, imagine a moral contract so deeply ingrained in your identity, so fundamental to your sense of honor, that you would literally risk the lives of your own family to uphold it.
Beza is a complex concept. It translates roughly to keeping one's word or faith. But in practice, it functions as a sacred, inviolable obligation of hospitality and protection.
In traditional Albanian culture, if a guest enters your home and you give them your besa, you are honor-bound to protect them from any harm, even at the cost of your own life. It is the ultimate social safety net in a society without a reliable police force.
And this isn't just a theoretical concept from medieval folklore. The sources highlight a stunning historical application of Besa during World War II that completely upends what we think we know about the Holocaust in Europe.
It's an incredible piece of history. During the Nazi occupation of Europe, the Jewish population was systematically hunted down and exterminated. Yet, Albania was the only European country to emerge from World War II with a significantly larger Jewish population than before the war started.
Let that sink in. A larger population. How did that mechanism work? It wasn't because the state protected them. The state was occupied by fascist Italy and then Nazi Germany.
It was entirely driven by the civilian population adhering to Besa. Albanian families, both Muslim and Christian, opened their doors to Jewish refugees fleeing from Yugoslavia, Greece, and Austria.
Once they gave these refugees their Besa, they hid them in their homes, dressed them in traditional Albanian clothing to blend in, gave them Muslim names, and flat out refused to hand them over to the Nazi authorities.
The Gestapo demanded lists of Jewish citizens from the local authorities, and the authorities repeatedly refused to provide them. The cultural mandate to protect a guest simply overrode the terror of the occupying army.
It is the ultimate expression of human decency, anchored by an ancient code. But we have to be balanced here in our analysis, because relying on ancient codes instead of a formal justice system has a very dark side, particularly when you look at the Kanun.
Yes, the Kanun of Leki Dukajini. It's the most famous set of traditional customary laws passed down orally for centuries, primarily in the rugged northern mountains.
While it codifies the noble concepts of Besa and hospitality, it also regulates property disputes, marriage, and critically criminal justice. And its mechanism for justice is Jak Marja, or the blood feud.
The rules of the blood feud are shockingly specific. If a member of your family was murdered, the state wasn't going to solve it. The Kanun demanded that you restore your family's honor by taking the life of a male member of the killer's family.
And this wasn't chaotic violence. It was highly regulated. You couldn't kill women, children, or priests. You couldn't kill a man while he was accompanied by a woman.
And you could negotiate temporary truces, or besa, to allow men to harvest crops without fear of being shot. But fundamentally, it created generational cycles of revenge.
A family might be trapped inside their defensive stone tower homes called kulas for years, unable to step outside without being targeted.
During the chaos of the 1997 pyramid scheme collapse, when the state police vanished and 1.5 million weapons flooded the streets, these ancient blood feuds saw a tragic resurgence. Without a state to arbitrate disputes, people reverted to the Kanun to settle scores.
So you have a society deeply reliant on familial networks and ancient codes because their domestic institutions are profoundly broken. But geopolitically, they were still incredibly vulnerable. Which brings us to 1998 and the events that forged the ultimate geopolitical bond between Albania and the United States.
This is the critical turning point for understanding modern Albanian foreign relations. It centers entirely around the Kosovo War. Now, before we dive into the mechanics of this conflict, I want to explicitly reiterate something for our listener.
Important context here.
Yes. Our mission on the topic lens is to impartially report the history and the perspectives found in our source material. The Balkans are a region with deeply complex, politically charged conflicts where historical narratives directly clash. We absolutely do not take sides on geopolitical claims. Our goal is to explain the perspectives of the people involved so you can understand their motivations.
Understood. So to provide the necessary context, Kosovo was a province within the borders of Serbia, which itself was part of the larger state of Yugoslavia. However, the population of Kosovo was overwhelmingly comprised of ethnic Albanians.
Right.
For Serbia, Kosovo is viewed as the historical, cultural, and spiritual cradle of their nation. It is the site of their most sacred medieval Orthodox monasteries and the location of the foundational 1389 Battle of Kosovo.
But for the ethnic Albanians living there, the reality of the 1990s under Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic was defined by severe systemic oppression. In 1989, Milosevic revoked Kosovo's autonomy.
Ethnic Albanians were purged from state jobs, the police force, and the education system. They essentially had to create a parallel underground society just to run schools and hospitals.
As peaceful resistance failed to yield results, an armed insurgency emerged known as the Kosovo Liberation Army. They began attacking Serbian state targets.
And the Serbian military and police response was overwhelming and brutal. It evolved into a massive counterinsurgency campaign that frequently targeted civilian villages, leading to the mass displacement of hundreds of thousands of ethnic Albanians.
The humanitarian crisis was catastrophic. The television broadcasts in 1998 and 1999 showed endless lines of refugees pouring over the mountain borders, primarily down into Albania.
In keeping with the concept of Besa, the Albanian population opened their doors completely. Families in Tirana and Kukis took complete strangers into their homes to house the refugees.
But diplomatic efforts by the international community to halt the violence repeatedly failed. And that is when the geopolitical dynamics shifted permanently. In 1999, the United States, leading a NATO coalition, stepped in.
To halt the ethnic cleansing and force the withdrawal of Serbian troops, NATO launched a 78-day bombing campaign against Serbian military and infrastructure targets.
If we look at the mechanics of this intervention through the lens of Albanian history, the psychological impact is profound. For centuries, whenever great powers intervened in the Balkans, it resulted in Albanian land being partitioned, or their interests being ignored, exactly like the traumatic 1913 London Conference.
But this time, the script was flipped. A global superpower deployed its immense military and diplomatic might specifically to protect an Albanian population.
For the first time in their modern history, they had an unequivocally powerful ally who actually came to their defense and forced their oppressor to retreat. Kosovo eventually declared independence in 2008, a move strongly backed by the U.S.
The cultural result of this intervention is mind-blowing. The level of adoration for the United States in Albania, and particularly in Kosovo, outshines almost any other ally on Earth.
It's not just polite diplomatic alignment, it's an emotional, grassroots reverence. If you walk down the street in Pristina, the capital of Kosovo, you will find a massive 10-foot-tall bronze statue of Bill Clinton standing on a major boulevard named after him. There's a women's clothing store right near it named Hillary.
In Tirana, the capital of Albania, there is a street named after George W. Bush. Because in 2007, he became the first sitting U.S. president to visit the country, and he received a rock star welcome.
He waded into crowds of people trying to hug him. The pro-American sentiment is woven into the fabric of their modern national identity. They view the U.S. as the ultimate guarantor of their existence.
But this deep bond with America isn't just based on military interventions from afar. It is a deeply intertwined physical relationship because of the massive Albanian diaspora actually living and working in the United States.
This is a crucial piece of the puzzle. We discussed the demographic inversion earlier. The shocking reality is that there are likely more ethnic Albanians living outside the borders of Albania and Kosovo than there are living inside them.
That is the textbook definition of a diaspora nation. The country itself is essentially a homeland hub, but the true scale of the population is spread globally.
Emigration isn't just a modern trend for them, it is a historical survival mechanism. And the United States has been one of the primary destinations. The sources break down Albanian immigration to the U.S. into 4 distinct historical waves.
Let's trace those waves. The first wave began in the late 19th century, roughly from the 1890s to the 1920s. These were predominantly young, single men from the southern regions of Albania.
They weren't fleeing war, they were economic migrants looking for wage labor. And in the early 20th century, if you wanted unskilled labor, you went to where the factories were booming.
They went to Massachusetts. They gravitated toward the textile mills, wire factories, and shoe factories of Massachusetts. Cities like Worcester and Boston became the very first major Albanian hubs in America.
They established the first Albanian Orthodox churches in the U.S. there. Worcester essentially served as the intellectual and cultural incubator for the early Albanian American community. To this day, the Massachusetts community remains one of the oldest, most established, and wealthiest hubs.
And then the pipeline gets shut down by history. The Immigration Act of 1924 heavily restricted quotas, and then World War II broke out. That leads us to Wave 2.
Wave 2 came immediately post-World War II. The demographic makeup of this group was entirely different from the factory workers of the first wave. These were political exiles.
They were intellectuals, landowners, and anti-communist fighters who had lost the Civil War to Enver Hoxha. They were fleeing the new dictatorship to save their lives. They were highly educated, but they arrived with nothing.
After that, the border slammed shut completely. During the Cold War, Hoxha turned Albania into a fortress. Nobody gets in, nobody gets out. For 40 years, the diaspora in America is cut off from their families back home.
But when the communist regime collapses in 1991, the dam breaks and Wave 3 begins. Wave 3 is massive and desperate. You had tens of thousands of people fleeing extreme poverty, the collapse of state industries, and the sheer chaos of the post-communist transition.
This wave heavily populated the tri-state area around New York. And finally, you have Wave 4 in the late 1990s, which was driven specifically by refugees fleeing the ethnic cleansing of the Kosovo War.
Let's look at where they ended up. because the geographic hubs they built in the U.S. are fascinating. The absolute largest concentration today is in New York's, specifically the Bronx, Westchester County, and Staten Island.
But the mechanism of how they integrated into New York is what really caught my eye in the sources. They didn't just build brand new neighborhoods from scratch. They systematically moved into existing enclaves, specifically historic Italian-American neighborhoods.
It's a brilliant example of immigrant succession. Take Belmont in the Bronx, an area historically famous as Little Italy. Over the last few decades, as the older generations of Italian Americans accumulated wealth and moved out to the suburbs, Albanian immigrants moved in to fill the vacuum.
And the transition was surprisingly smooth, because historically, Albania and Italy have deep cultural and linguistic crossovers.
Remember the proximity across the Adriatic Sea. During the communist years, many Albanians learned to speak Italian by secretly rigging antennas to pick up Italian television broadcasts.
They shared a Mediterranean cultural affinity, strong family networks, patriarchal structures, and a deep appreciation for espresso culture. So they essentially stepped into the existing Italian infrastructure. They took over the management of the pizza shops, the bakeries, and the cafes.
They kept the traditional Italian aesthetic because it was good for business, but they changed the ownership, and they applied an incredibly aggressive work ethic toward real estate.
They pooled capital within extended family networks to buy multifamily homes and apartment buildings. Some demographic reports estimate that Albanian American families and syndicates now own a staggering percentage of the residential real estate in the Bronx.
They leveraged manual labor in construction and building management to build substantial generational economic power.
That's the New York strategy. But there is another major hub that has a fantastic historical quirk to it: Michigan. Specifically, the suburbs around Detroit. I was looking at the demographic heat maps in the sources, and there is this incredibly weird anomaly. You've got obvious coastal hubs like New York and Boston, and then suddenly Detroit.
Which is tied directly to the auto industry. In 1914, Henry Ford announced he would pay his assembly line workers $5 a day, which was more than double the standard industrial wage at the time.
It was an irresistible magnet for immigrants across the country. Albanians who were working grueling shifts in the mills of Massachusetts packed up and moved to Michigan to work in the auto plants.
But they didn't just stay on the assembly lines. They used those factory wages as seed capital for entrepreneurship. They did what many immigrant groups do. They identified a niche and dominated it.
They saved their money, pooled resources with cousins and brothers, and started buying up small diners. Today, you go to a Coney Island, which is the iconic 24-hour diner format in the Detroit area, famous for serving Greek salads and chili dogs. There is a massive statistical probability that it is owned and operated by an Albanian-American family.
I love that image. The quintessential Detroit culinary experience, the chili dog, is being served up by an Albanian immigrant family who arrived to build cars. It is the ultimate American melting pot story.
And because of this widespread integration, our listener definitely knows more Albanians than they realize. The cultural footprint of this diaspora, especially in modern pop culture, is wildly disproportionate to the size of the home country.
It really is a fascinating phenomenon. When you look at the sheer volume of global icons with Albanian heritage, it's staggering. Historically, the most famous person of Albanian descent is Mother Teresa.
Right. She was born in what is now Skopje, North Macedonia, to an ethnic Albanian family. But what about modern entertainment?
In the modern music industry, diaspora women essentially dominate the pop charts. Megastars like Dua Lipa and Rita Ora both have Kosovo-Albanian roots. Their families fled the rising tensions in the Balkans in the 1990s and settled in the UK, where their girls were raised.
Bebe Rexha and Ava Max are both Albanian Americans, too. Why do you think that is? Is there a specific mechanism that propels diaspora kids to that level of success?
It feels like the dual identity growing up with the intense work ethic and pressure of an immigrant household, combined with the creative infrastructure of London or New York, creates a massive drive to succeed. They aren't just participating in pop culture, they are actively driving it.
And they are fiercely proud of their roots. You constantly see these pop stars making the double-headed eagle hand gesture during concerts or proudly promoting Albanian tourism.
Beyond music, you have Hollywood history. The Belushi brothers, John and Jim, grew up in an Albanian-American family in Chicago. In science, you have Farid Mirad, who won the Nobel Prize in medicine. In sports, athletes like Exerdan Shaqiri, who famously wears cleats with the Albanian flag.
It's incredible. They have exported their talent everywhere, but with such a massive global footprint, it naturally makes me wonder, what is the actual country of Albania like today? If you, the listener, were to book a flight to Tirana tomorrow, What are you walking into?
We definitely need to dismantle some pervasive stereotypes here. Starting with the biggest stereotype of all, heavily perpetuated by Western media and Hollywood.
I know exactly where you're going. The movie Taken? Liam Neeson on the phone, delivering the famous line, "I have a very particular set of skills." And the bad guys on the other end of the line are portrayed as ruthless, untouchable Albanian mobsters running human trafficking rings in Paris.
Films like Taken have successfully painted a deeply damaging picture of Albania as a lawless, violent country run by sophisticated mafia syndicates.
Yeah.
Now, to be objectively clear based on the sources, does Albanian organized crime exist in Europe?
Yes.
Transnational criminal networks originating from the Balkans are a documented issue for European law enforcement, particularly regarding drug logistics. But the reality for a visitor inside the borders of Albania is completely disconnected from that Hollywood narrative. Albania is actually one of the safest countries for tourists in all of Europe.
The domestic rate of violent street crime, muggings, or assaults against visitors is incredibly low. The hospitality culture we discussed earlier, rooted in the ancient concept of besa, still permeates everyday interactions. Tourists are viewed as guests in the country, and there is a deep cultural mandate to treat guests with extreme warmth, respect, and protection.
Another major myth revolves around religion. Because demographic surveys often show a majority Muslim population, people from the West sometimes assume it must be a strict conservative religious state with rigid social codes.
Which could not be further from the truth. Albania is deeply, profoundly secular. You have to remember the legacy of Enver Hoxha. This is a society where organized religion was violently suppressed and effectively erased from public life for decades.
Today, religious identity is viewed much more as a cultural heritage than a strict dogmatic practice. You will find Muslims and Christians intermarrying constantly, without it causing societal friction. You'll find widespread alcohol consumption, a vibrant nightlife, and very relaxed social mores.
And their approach to Islam itself is incredibly unique. They are the global headquarters for a specific sect, right? The Bektashi order.
Yes, it's a liberal, syncretic, Sufi Islamic brotherhood. Their world headquarters is located in Tirana. The Bektashis are renowned for their focus on inner spiritual development rather than rigid adherence to external rules. They are known for their tolerance, their promotion of interfaith harmony, and their lax rules on things like dietary restrictions and traditional dress codes.
Okay, so it's safe, it's secular, and the people are welcoming. But how is the actual machinery of the country doing? What is the economic reality on the ground today?
It is fundamentally a developing economy, currently sized around $25 billion, according to recent IMF estimates. It is growing, but it still faces significant structural hurdles. The formal economy relies heavily on three main pillars. First, as we mentioned, the massive influx of remittances from the diaspora.
Right.
Second, hydropower. Because of their steep mountain rivers, almost 100% of their domestically generated electricity comes from hydroelectric dams, making it a very green grid, though vulnerable to droughts. And third, a rapidly exploding tourism sector.
Tourism seems to be their golden ticket right now. Travel influencers are constantly branding it as the next Mediterranean hotspot. You get Amalfi Coast-style beaches and pristine mountain hiking trails, but at a fraction of the cost of Italy or Greece. And the food culture seems to be a major draw. Our sources described it as the ultimate farm-to-table reality.
It is, but we need to clarify what farm-to-table means in this context. It is not a trendy, expensive marketing gimmick designed for hipsters in Brooklyn. It's simply how they have always sustained themselves. The agricultural sector is still dominated by small-scale, family-owned plots.
Industrialized corporate farming never took over. So when you eat at a local restaurant, the tomatoes, the cheese, the olive oil, the lamb, it was likely grown or raised by someone the chef knows personally, just a few miles away.
The ingredients are incredibly fresh because the supply chains are hyperlocal. If a listener goes, the quintessential meal they need to track down is tavikosi, which is widely considered the national dish.
It's a savory, baked casserole of tender lamb and rice, entirely smothered in a thick, tart mixture of yogurt and eggs. And for everyday street food, you eat byrek. It's a flaky, savory pastry made of thin layers of phyllo dough, stuffed with spinach, local feta cheese, or minced meat.
Beyond the food and the beaches, the urban landscape of modern Tirana is vibrant, dynamic, and surprisingly colorful. And the mechanism behind that transformation is largely tied to one very unique political figure, the current Prime Minister, Edi Rama.
Edi Rama is a fascinating character study in global politics. He doesn't fit the typical mold of a bureaucrat. Before he entered national politics, he was the mayor of Tirana. And before that, he was a professional practicing artist.
He actually lived in Paris as a painter. When he was elected mayor in the early 2000s, he inherited a city that was broke. The infrastructure was crumbling, the public parks were overrun with illegal, ugly concrete kiosks built during the chaotic 90s, and the populace was deeply demoralized by the gray communist architecture.
He had no budget to demolish and rebuild the city, so he utilized a cheap, high-impact psychological intervention. He ordered the gray apartment blocks to be painted,
Oh.
and not just painted nicely. He used his artist background to design wild, vibrant geometric patterns, bright pinks, deep yellows, electric blues.
He essentially used urban design as a tool for civic therapy. He theorized that changing the aesthetic environment would change the civic mindset. And it worked. The bright colors signaled that the dark era was over.
It encouraged citizens to take pride in their neighborhoods, and it actually sparked a reduction in petty vandalism and a revitalization of local businesses. Rama rode that success to the top of national politics, and he has been the towering figure leading the Socialist Party for years.
Which brings a very funny historical irony to light when you look at their political landscape. Albania is a parliamentary republic, and the political scene is dominated by two main factions: the Socialist Party, led by Rama, and the Democratic Party.
The socialists actually trace their institutional lineage back to Enver Hoxha's old authoritarian Communist Party. Yet today they are aggressively pro-market, pro-business, and desperately trying to integrate into Western capitalist structures.
And the Democrats were founded in the 1990s by fierce anti-communists and student protesters. But regardless of the intense, often bitter personal rivalries between these parties, they essentially agree on the ultimate strategic goal for the country.
Which is complete and irreversible Western integration. They successfully joined NATO in 2009. But the holy grail, the ultimate economic and political prize, is full membership in the European Union. They are officially a candidate country, but the accession process is agonizingly slow.
The EU demands rigorous structural reforms before they hand over the keys to the club. Albania still struggles with entrenched political corruption and an inefficient judiciary. Furthermore, we talked about that informal economy estimates suggest that 30 to 40% of the economy operates off the books, entirely untaxed.
You cannot integrate into the highly regulated European single market with that level of financial opacity. The EU is essentially forcing them to clean house, professionalize their civil service, and establish the rule of law. It's a painful process, but the Albanian people overwhelmingly support it because they view EU membership as their final escape from the turbulence of the Balkans.
It is an incredible journey. If we try to synthesize the Albanian soul based on all these disparate sources, it is fundamentally a story of profound resilience.
This is a society that survived the Roman Empire, navigated 400 years of Ottoman rule, endured the most extreme form of communist isolation, and weathered the total collapse of their state apparatus.
Yet if you visit today, they are not a broken people. They remain incredibly optimistic, deeply hospitable to strangers, and famously pro-Western. They survived the chaos of history by relying on the only things they could trust: their families, their honor codes, and an unyielding grip on their unique language.
I think that is a perfect, profound place to wrap up our analysis. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day. We started this episode talking about the illusion of the map, those solid black lines that we assume define a nation.
Right.
Think about how Albania's borders were arbitrarily drawn by foreign diplomats in London in 1913, leaving half its people outside the country. A geographic amputation like that could have easily erased a smaller nation from the pages of history. But it didn't.
No, it didn't.
Instead, the Albanian people survived, and they ultimately utilized that historical displacement to build a massive, interconnected global diaspora. A diaspora that ended up exporting their relentless work ethic, their culinary traditions to Detroit, their pop stars to the top of the global charts, and their geopolitical influence from the Bronx all the way back to the Balkans.
It really begs the question: is the true strength of a nation found within the fragile lines drawn on a map? Or is it found within the unbreakable resilience of its people wherever they are forced to go?
That is exactly the kind of context the map fails to show us. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Our goal with this new Topic Lens series is to help build a bridge of understanding across the Atlantic, to unpack the dense ancient histories of Europe and contrast them with the unique, dynamic cultures of American states, one letter at a time. Have a great day and make sure to join us tomorrow as we cross the Atlantic. We are moving from a European country to an American state that shares almost the exact same name, but has a wildly different history, economy, and culture. We are dissecting Alabama. See you then.